Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. With me today is Dr. Chris McGrath, Vice President of Student Affairs at Niagara College, and also the founder of Koru Coaching, dedicated to cultivating authentic and sustainable leadership capacity for social change. Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So, Chris, social change. Tell me about social change. What do we need to change, and whose responsibility is it?
Let's see here.
I'll start light.
Yeah, exactly. Let's start with an easy question. I guess, I'll first off start by acknowledging the fact that, today I'm here in the Niagara region, just in southern Ontario, and I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people. I think when we talk about social change for us here on Turtle Island in Canada, that's where it starts in thinking about and talking about and contemplating our relationships, not only with one another as Canadians, one another as settlers, but also our relationships to First Nations people, Inuit, Métis, and those who were here for millennia before settlers ever arrived. I think a lot of the challenges that we experience as a community these days, as a society these days, somehow stem from, I think, the practices of colonialism and capitalism that overtook this land so many years ago. And so there's a lot to be done. There's a lot that needs attention, but over the course of my career and over the course of my own work, all paths seem to lead me back in some ways to a need to reconcile our history, our past, and look to really indigenize and rethink how it is that we think, how we know, and how we do things.
So, are you talking then about, when you talk about how we think, how we do things individually, collectively, somewhere in between?
Well, I think change at the collective level really starts at the individual level, but the impetus for individual change, I think, actually has to be prompted by the collective. So, to quote one of my colleagues here at Niagara, yes, no, yes. It's yes and a no and a yes all at the same time. When it comes to the work of social change, and I focus on this in my coaching practice, and this is also a little bit at the heart of my own research, is that if we want to change society, if we want to change the institutions that are represented in a civil society, we actually have to motivate change among the people who constitute the culture of those organizations and those structures and those institutions. But you can't change the collective without, I think, a deep-seated and humble and, I think, courageous desire on the part of individuals to change themselves. And so I think that the motivation or the impetus or the burning imperative for change has to be shared by the collective. But I suggest that the work to be done is deeply personal and individual in order for that collective change to, in fact, be successful. Organizations are arguably, our cultures are arguably a cognate. They're a sum product of the people who work and learn and coexist together. And so I think we have to look at how it is that we help people to, I think, unlearn and then relearn their ways of knowing and being so that things can actually change for the better.
So, is that the responsibility of a business organization or a university? And I just asked that because I'm involved with both, as you know, and I know that you are too. As an owner or a shareholder in an organization, is social change my prerogative or my choice as a leader?
Well, I think you're playing with a couple of different constructs there. We can talk about owner, we can talk about leader, we can talk about a shareholder, we can talk about a teacher. I think among all of those things, what's in common for me, regardless of the roles that people in those positions might play, is that in some way we're all deeply connected as citizens of a community. And so I would argue that regardless of the moniker that one might use to describe the work that they do, I'd say it's probably a moral imperative, a public good imperative that we all have to simply just live in community and make our communities better. How that plays out for people is going to be obviously very different depending on whether they're an owner, a stakeholder, a leader, whatnot. And largely, I think those titles or those positions are really, they're just constructs of different ways of thinking about how we all hold power, influence, and agency in our organizations and in our communities. But I think we have to draw upon what is common across pretty much everybody, is a shared sense of humanity, and connecting that humanity to a shared sense of citizenry and citizenship and what it means to be a contributing member of a civil society.
So I love that reference. I love that wording when you say humanity. I think for me, and I asked that question knowing that I have changed a lot myself over a 35 plus year entrepreneurship journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in the last 15 to 20 years, I've learned more humanity. And I haven't called it cultural change. I haven't called it a shift in leadership style. I just call it recognizing what is good in people and how to be good to those around us,
Mm-hmm.
and influencing those people around me to treat people in that same way.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say that, I'm wondering how easy or doable is it with, and I'm not that old, but older generations versus just creating that groundswell at the student or next generation level.
I think for those of us of a certain age, and I would include myself in maybe a generation of people who are realizing perhaps sooner than we thought, we're talking about, back when I was ... a phrase that I use
Yes.
perhaps more frequently than I ever thought I would. In some ways, it requires a degree of courage in leadership and bravery in leadership to, I think, disrupt our thinking, to disrupt sort of our pathways to how we've come to hold roles and places that we currently do. Like I think about my own career. I've been working in post-secondary education for nearly 25 years. I've had a very successful career moving through working in colleges and universities to support students and student experience, and considered a privilege to be able to do so, particularly here at Niagara. But I acknowledge that as a cisgendered white man, that pathway to the space that I hold now as a vice president is arguably and defensibly easier for me than it has been for other people, despite the fact that I still move through the world as someone who identifies as queer, as who sees the world with different perspectives around ability. I move through the world with a degree of privilege that I didn't ask for. I inherited it by virtue of genetics, and that comes with responsibility. And so I think there's a degree of there has to be a degree of willingness and courage on the part of those of us who hold some of these positions of power, me as a vice president, or it can be a position of power of a teacher in a classroom, or it can be a position of power of a manager in the workplace, to acknowledge that our paths to those destinations have been, I think, largely carved on, steps of privilege, which is what it is. But because we hold these spaces, we now have the opportunity to use that power for good, to begin to create new pathways and invite others to consider whether or not being a vice president or being a teacher or being a researcher or the leader or CEO of a company, whether or not those are pathways that they wish to pursue. And if so, how, with humanity, can we help them to define some of those pathways in their own way? The humanity in education, particularly, is really about honoring the fact that students as learners are not empty vessels to be filled with knowledge. They're individuals with their own talents, their own potential, their own strengths, their own capabilities. And more than anything, they have their own autonomy and agency. And that self-determination that learners have, and if we create spaces where we can offer it up so that they can fully fulfill that agency and that potential, that's where I'd say our responsibilities come in as people of a certain generation. We're at this really critical point of, I think, being folks who've seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, who've seen, the days when rotary dial telephones became obsolete, and we're really excited by a cordless that was still sitting in the kitchen of the house. And now we all have really powerful computers in our pockets that when they ring as a phone, we're almost offended by the fact that someone's calling us. Like, we have witnessed and experienced a vast transformation in how society works. And because we can still remember the good old days, or the moments of, well, back when I was a kid, a teenager, et cetera, I think that memory comes with responsibility, and the foresight to know that things can and ought to be very different for people. And so it's really tough work to do. I think it takes a big leap of faith. I think it takes courage, it takes bravery, and sometimes it takes acknowledging that you got to take a step back so that others can step forward. Or in some ways, you got to step aside and get out of the way. So, and there's something at risk there. There's our own self-determination, there's our own autonomy, there's our own sense of achievement. There's also, there's economic realities. How likely is it that as a cisgendered white man, that if I'm offered a promotion, I'd be like, no, it's not my time. Create the space for someone else. Well, not having that offer on the table, I can't tell you what the likelihood is. But idealistically and ideologically, I think about, would I even pursue it because I know that I'm doing the best I can in the space that I hold and allowing an opportunity for someone else to step up if they wish to do so. And that's even if I would get the opportunity in the first place. So it's checking our thinking and our assumptions about what we're entitled to, about the steps we next take, about whether or not we're even entitled to put a step on that career ladder that's been put in front of us just by virtue of who we are. That's where I think a lot of this work has to be done. And that's why in my coaching work, when I think about helping leaders to become better leaders for a better world, my focus is actually on helping leaders who want to do better within themselves, to acknowledge their own bias, their own opportunity to interrupt thinking and ways of being and practicing, and to, with grace and humanity and humility, I think create some of those opportunities to let others and to allow others to lift themselves up. That's where the heavy lifting is for folks of our generation.
I look at Say Hi to the Future. I look at the different communities that we support through hackathons at different universities or whatnot. The teaching I do, and a lot of that is international students coming to learn and see and experience different culture. I don't know if from my generation, the best thing is to step aside. And what I mean by that is, if I am truly respectful and open and doing what I can, shouldn't I push harder to go further, which empowers more people coming up through the next generation?
I think it's a really valid question, and the answer to that for you is probably going to be different than than my answer for myself. I think that depending on the situation, if you can push harder to get further ahead to then create more openings for others, because others who may not otherwise have the opportunity aren't simply going to be able to push as hard because they're not invited to even try, then that may very well be part of the moral imperative that you have and how you do things. But when I look at some of the work that I do in and around education and think about what some of the needs are around educational organizations, particularly as it relates to students and employees from equity deserving communities, am I best positioned to lead? Well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm best, but I have a knowledge capital and a social capital and an understanding of what it's like to be marginalized by virtue of how I experience the world. And in some ways, I also have the advantage of being an insider because I hold power and influence in an organization. And so I think if you can operate leadership, if you can lead in a way that's tempered, and there's a researcher named Deb Meyerson whose work I explored in my own doctoral work around tempered radicalism, and her work really surfaces the experiences of people who identify as part of the queer community in post-secondary organizations and how they use their insider knowledge and power to in fact affect change for those who are on the margins. If you have the social capital, the influence, and the understanding to push harder, you can in fact use quote unquote your powers for good. Or as Audre Lorde would say, you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. At the very basic of that phrasing, I suggest that maybe you can, if you know how to manipulate the master's tools. And so if you can push harder to then be in a position whereby you can redefine the structures, the systems, eliminate the barriers, then by all means push. and move forward. But I think if we're at this nexus where we may need to step aside, we have to have the humility and the courage to be able to do that.
I completely agree with that. And I love, again, the communication and the understanding of the different levels that we can be at, because I think when you talk about the master's tools and rebuilding with the master's tools, I'm refurbishing. I'm getting rid of all of the old notions or the outdated notions or the wrong notions, whatever the bad ones, whatever you want to call them, and refitting with what I think are more inclusive and inclusive in anywhere you want to look at it, gender-based, belief-based, and trying to bring them into the same house, whether it's in educational rooms or in, again, like the Say Hi to the Future rooms, where diversity with a capital D is absolutely one of our founding principles.
Yeah, I think, that drive towards inclusion and the drive towards dismantling the way we do things to, in fact, refurbish or re-engineer it with a degree of universality. And so, we talk about it in educational practice as universal design for learning. We can take those very same principles that influence how we can create inclusive learning environments and overlay them onto how we look at systems, structures, policy, built environment, buildings, online structures and experiences for learners. We can overlay that in how we think about how employees engage with or their organizations. If we start with universality as a principle to begin with, where everybody has a degree of expertise, and that's at the heart of universal design for learning, is that it's about helping to develop expert learners versus individuals who, again, are these empty containers that seek to be filled because they want to become workers in the economy. So by virtue of dismantling, by virtue of refurbishing, we actually, I think, have to propose an entirely different language at the same time. I mean, we see it in education policy and in government policy, particularly in the past, I'd say 15, 20 years, about how post-secondary institutions have a responsibility and a role to play in building economies and preparing, students for jobs of the future. So they are workers. And even like if we think about the language that's used in some of that policy dialogue versus how are we creating spaces for community members to engage with one another, develop relationships, identify common strengths, collaborate to solve complex problems and define and move towards better futures together. Like there's a different dialogue to be had. So I suggest that the work you're doing around refurbishment probably also needs to come with a revision or maybe even a complete refresh of the instruction manual with an entirely new language and a whole new set of tools. And so what we're both talking about, is it radical? Probably, but you have influence in the work that you do. I have influence in the work that I do. And the notions of tempered radicalism and also the notions of even how social change happens is it takes a whole lot of little things to add up to the types of transformation that we're talking about. And that's where, again, I keep coming back to, as leaders, we have to know ourselves. The work has to happen within us. We have to commit to, this type of work as an ongoing project for the rest of our lives of unlearning, relearning, and learning again. And that continuum of learning, that's at the heart of even indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And that's what I was saying earlier about all roads are leading back to indigenization and reconciliation, because in the spirit of indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, people should be in constant dialogue and relationship with the land because we're part of it. And how we listen to one another and listen to the planet, that ought to dictate in a very natural law, natural justice kind of way, the types of things that we ought to be doing with and for one another.
So I hear you speak to that, I understand it and I intellectually agree with it, but I'm going to take this in a very different direction now.
Yeah.
So the generations behind us, and I have a gaggle of kids in their 20s through their children and stepchildren, and they're friends and all the communities that I've been a part of, and they're always telling me about what we did wrong, what we did incorrectly, and learning not to hate and learning, to be together and humanity. And then I look at what they're learning. And
Mhm.
when I say this, and I don't want to be overly negative, but it is somewhat, you know, negative about social media. This generation is learning to hate and express hatred towards one another in more ways than I could have ever imagined, through more platforms and more quickly. And,
Yeah.
and I know I'm just stating the negative side, but how do you rationalize the two? I'm being, that's not fair, but I'll say it. I'm being lectured about humanity, and I'm reading things that I just could never have said to anybody ever anywhere in my life.
Where I think I hear what you're saying, and I think, you know, we have over time, again, thinking about that transition from rotary dial to now this little baby that sits in my pocket on a good day, the iPhone. Um,
Mhm.
we've seen this rapid evolution of technology, and we are in some ways caught in positions where we're always reacting to it. And we're seeing this with the whole dialogue around artificial intelligence in education. What I think we need to do is stake a claim and begin to make some decisions about how we get ahead of, or again, tools, how do we use some of these tools for good, and then teach others to actually do the same, or help our younger generations to do the same. I think the rampant evolution of social media, of technology, which again is the platforms where a lot of this hatred is expressed and distributed and then amplified. That's all evolved without sort of quote unquote us older folks knowing. And I'm not suggesting
Mhm.
that there's a paternalism to this, but in some ways, I ask myself, did we choose to ignore the evolution of what was happening? Like, were we like I think about, we're on Facebook and everyone else is already on on TikTok or whatever the case may be. Like, are we still too stuck in our past? Or are we needing to accelerate some of our learning curve to then keep up and get ahead to try and help safeguard? So I think there's a
Right.
question about what it is that we have to do. I do think there are some boundaries, dare I say, or some bumper pads we have to put in place with our younger folks around how technology gets used so that they understand its responsible use, they understand how to use it with critique, and that not everything that pops up in a notification is a capital T truth. But at the same time, we have inculcated them through education systems that are about, this is what you need to learn in order to get a job. So our education system is part of, a social industrial complex of knowledge manufacturing in some ways. And yet we're expecting them to behave as good, responsible citizens. So there's a gap. And is it the responsibility of the educational system and its structures to teach that gap, or is that actually our responsibilities as parents, uncles, friends, mentors, etc.? We're seeing this play out in the conversation around the ban of cell phones and mobile phones in classrooms, which is coming in the fall, and in the public education system. And early on, I remember people saying, like, how has this happened? How has it gotten to this point? And in the back of my head, I remember thinking at some point there was a parent or someone who's a caregiver who either purchased the $1,500 device or allowed that purchase to happen and enable and continues to enable its use. Because I hear from teacher colleagues who say one of the reasons why parents are pushing back so hard on access to mobile phones in classrooms is because parents, well, they don't, how am I supposed to get a hold of my kid? Well, you're not supposed to get a hold of your kid because they're learning geography. So that, like, there's a disconnect there. And
Yes.
so I think, again, it comes back to, how are we interrupting our ways of functioning, being, and doing? Because otherwise, they're not going to change. All they're going to do is hear us as, oh yeah, yeah, you're saying this, but you're doing the opposite. So why would I
Yes.
act? with that lack of integrity. So that's where I think a lot of this has to happen. And I come back to, again, this idea of really, I think, infusing how we do the work of education with humanity, how we're helping learners to understand, create relationships with one another, do so with compassion, with care, with empathy, dare I say, with love, so that they actually do feel a connection to one another and an interdependency and a social responsibility to one another. That those who work in the community development space would say the more that you increase a sense of community and belonging, the more likely that you are to decrease negative types of behaviors within that community. We spend less of our time in building the communities and more of our time in trying to regulate negative behavior. So I think we have to either strike a new balance or really shift our lens and our priority.
And I would just add to that, because I think you nailed it, but an understanding about how humanity builds empathy and draws upon knowledge. Because I mean, while I do a lot of things through Zoom or through Teams, including teaching at certain times, I don't believe you can truly build empathy for a 1 inch by 1 inch picture of somebody. I'm just don't believe that. And I might be a million% wrong, but I just don't see it in my experience.
It's really tough to do. And I've taught online and I've taught in person. I do a lot of work online, even just in my day-to-day work. Most of my coaching's online. And I'll be honest, I find coaching really challenging in a digital medium because I need to, and I believe that as a coach, I need to connect with the humanity of the person who I'm working with. I'd suggest that's the same for anybody who's a colleague of mine or students with whom I work, et cetera. Some of that, honestly, I do a lot of work online because it's efficient and it's easy and it's a choice. And that's the last
Mhm.
part of it. It's a choice. So I can choose to do the work differently. But then I come back to, well, if I had to do all my coaching in person, wow, like this little side hustle I have going as Koru Coaching and Education, I'm probably not going to make any money because I have clients across the country. Well, greed will always be there, money will always be there, but what's more important to me is it the quality of the work or the quantity of my work? I'm still figuring some of that out. And that's also, I think, part of this work of humanity is acknowledging that we're all still in an ongoing process of learning and unlearning. And but that's also what education is. I mean, it's this ongoing cycle. And I think we function in a society that wants performance and metrics and outcomes and standards. And yet we know from the literature and the research and the practice that the process matters so much more than the product. And if you focus on the process and the people and those relationships, you never have to worry about product and performance. But we're choosing to ignore that in some ways.
Yeah, but I think you hit it on, and I think it's with most of what we spoke about today. Just finding that balance, and again, for me, finding that balance is the ability to communicate and find common ground. And yes, as business people, at some point, we need to feed ourselves and our families.
Yeah.
So there is going to be a balance between hybrid and in person, especially in a major city like Toronto, where you can have an hour and a half commute. But
Yeah.
Chris,
And again, and that humanity piece again is having the compassion to acknowledge that it's tough to strike that balance, and we're all doing the best we can with the light that we have available to us. And so that's the way I think about it as a leader. That's how I reconcile some of those tensions in my own practice is this is the light I have available to me shining on the things that I'm trying to contend with. I'm only going to do the best I can in reconciling what's in front of me, knowing that I've got a set of values and sense of sort of moral obligation that I'm trying to work towards.
with that, and boy, it really went quickly. We've heard a lot about or inferences about your practices and what you do outside of Niagara College and whatnot. Koru Koru Coaching, excuse me.
Mhm.
As we end today, just tell me what that really is about. How does that sort of bring to bear all of the positive energy that you've spoken about in the last 30 odd minutes, and how you can bring that to bear within a client organization?
Well, I think it's the work that I and my colleague at Koru do is really with individuals who are parts of organizations who want to have conversations like this. Coaching with me or engaging with me is a space where we can have these types of conversations where I'm of course talking less and the client is talking a heck of a lot more. But creating a degree
Okay.
of holding a degree of structure lightly and creating, I think, a degree of safety so that people can contend with some of these issues and say, hey, listen, Chris, I believe everything you're saying, but at the end of the day, I got to put food on the table for my family. Like, how do I square that circle? Or, I lead a team of 300 people. Like, how am I supposed to motivate change? And so the work that we do at Koru is about creating some of that space and structure for people to work through this. We don't provide the solutions. We provide the structure and space to help people get to their own solutions. And that infuses my own practice as a leader here at the college. And it comes down to, one of the core principles of Paulo Freire's work as a critical theorist. Our job as leaders and as educators is to do with people, not for people. And so as a leader at the college, as a coach, as a consultant, whatever it is I do, I'm there to walk a path with someone so that they can actually generate some of their own solutions to the problems and issues that they're trying to contend with. So if folks engage with me in my regular day job or through my own consulting work and coaching work, that's what they can expect. And they can also expect a degree of opportunity to identify how they're going to hold themselves accountable to changing the things they say they want to change.
So, Dr. Chris McGrath, what I'm going to take away is enlightenment, empowerment, and humanity. And I thank you so much for joining us today on Say Hi to the Future.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been wonderful. I'm grateful for it. Thank you.